I'm going to be bad cop. Everyone else is good cops. So you got 4 good cops and 1 bad cop. But I'm going to, it is actually a good news story by the end of it. But what I'm going to do is take you down a little journey in which we look at how we arrived at this point. One of our big problems, I think, as a culture is what I call the ratchet effect. And that ratchet effect is like the meme you may have seen floating around the internet where you see the dog in the room and there's flames all around and the dog's saying, everything's fine, because you wind up in a situation where you got there because in our society you move around lots, you show up at new places, you live in a new house. When you show up there, that's how it should be. And one of the most important lessons I've learned is, like the words of Fred and Tim and elders from Cowichan tribes, is there was a group of people here before who managed a system for about 10,000 or more years. And that bounty that did exist can exist again. And hopefully by recognizing where we're at, we can begin to climb out of a state of misery where there's flames all around and we're going, everything is fine. Because there's lots of folks who are perfectly happy. And what we need to do, the obligation on folks like me who are collecting the data, is to try to paint a route towards getting to somewhere better. Oh.
It just takes a second.
Hmm?
I can do it from here if you like.
Page down.
Okay.
This down arrow? Oh, you don't have? Oh, good old Apple. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the historic monitoring and research that's happened here. The current monitoring and research, which is largely led by a group of nonprofits. Some of the water quality trends that we've taken out of the work we've started and continued on from previous work. And what's been happening with fish habitat. Tim shared with you a story about the kind of bounty that used to exist on places like Bings and Richards Creek. And those types of bounties represent losses to our economy of hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you've got 2,000 coho spawning, usually we're talking 80% fishing mortality, usually conservatively in a lot of the ways we manage most of our salmon stocks. So that represents 10,000 fish that would have been caught at sea. In a recreational fishery, which is about half of the fish that are caught at sea, each one of those guys is worth about $500 to the economy. Hiring outfitters, renting boats, doing all the rest of this. So Bings, Averill, Richards, these things were all factories for those sorts of fish. And you could easily see how those 3 places probably collectively produced 30, 40,000 coho for the ocean fishery. There's rainbow trout, there's cutthroat trout, and all of those opportunities have been lost in those lakes. So you can just imagine what's happened there. So it's a major focus of why we're rebuilding this is not just so that we can have the comfort of knowing that these great resources are in our backyard, but also the loss to our economy that's been incurred by that. And that's just fish, not to mention all the other stuff, which I'll get into. And I'm going to discuss at the end some of the management and research options we have to begin to move away from what we've dug ourselves into. Next. So these are some of the fish that are in the Kw'amutsun and Somenos system. We got coho salmon and adult juvenile up there. Rainbow trout, cutthroat trout, Chinook salmon. Chinook salmon don't spawn in Somenos and Qu'amutsun, but they do occupy the lower part of Somenos Creek, all part of the system. We've got sticklebacks, peamouth chub, an invasive species which a lot of you I'm sure have seen called pumpkin seed sunfish, which are quite colorful. If you go to Artman Park, if you step out of your car and just look off the edge, you'll see very often in the spring little divots in the ground about a foot wide. Those are little nests that the males have dug out and they're defending. This is about 90% of all the fish biomass in these systems now, is that one invasive species. And brown bullhead, which is a catfish. Next, please. So this is the area of the universe we're talking about. You saw the maps over there. The pink line here is the watershed for Qu'amutsun. Covers about my hand there. And this larger thing here, all of this, that's Somenos. So even though Somenos Lake is about 1/4 the size of Kw'amutsun Lake, it has a much larger drainage. So the water moves through it a lot quicker. Whereas Kw'amutsun Lake has very little water going into it in the summer. In fact, Quamichan Lake does not drain at all for most of the summer. Quamichan Creek runs dry beginning usually now in about May. And so the hydrology of the two systems is very different. So when we're coming up with management approaches for how to deal with it, it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's going to be different approaches that are necessary. And there's going to be different availabilities of water, for example. We've got 3 huge creeks going into Somenos Lake there, Bings, Averill, and Richards, whereas McIntyre and Elkington at the north end of Quamichan, again, pretty much run dry through most of the summer. So very, very different things. And these two systems, you can see all of this light brown area, that's all agricultural and urban development. That changes the way water is delivered to the environment as well. And as we'll see, also has a profound effect on some of the water quality observations we see now, which is pollutants and nutrients getting in there, which is compromising those lakes' ability to function as ecosystems and provide local folks with recreational opportunities and detracting from their property value by interfering with the lives of dogs and potentially humans if we allow it to get much worse. Next slide, please. So this is what she used to look like in the past. This is a map. Some of you have seen presentations I've done in the past where I show this. This was done in 1859 by the Royal Engineers. This was designed to, it's an annotated map. If you zoom in, it says good woodland, lots of farmland here, low areas here. It was designed to encourage people from England to come over. This was part of the emigration. There was a Department of Immigration in England, and this map was used by them to show folks what bounty they could come to. And one thing that I just want you to notice, because I'm going to be talking about how we got here with water quality, the kinds of things that were done to the land to change it in such a way that we've got a kind of a messed up system. Right here is Bings Creek, and Bings Creek now flows into Somenos Lake, but you can see that historically it didn't. A lot of our drainage problems in Somenos Creek are probably reflective of the fact that Somenos Creek here, draining the lake, is now having to handle about half again as much water as it would have had to have had in the past, right? And these are the sorts of things we've done. Here you have 3 channels of the Cowichan River flowing through downtown Duncan. That's now 1. And so the drainage of Somenos Creek has also been profoundly altered in that it branched off here. Coxsila River used to go up there. We have really altered the system. I was talking about that ratchet effect. The reason why a lot of old-timers call this Holmes Creek, Bings Creek, is because this was Holmes Creek. What happened was about 1910, the decision was made to punch it through on this little teeny creek here called Bings Creek, which was named Bings after the owner of the sawmill there. And so when Holmes Creek was routed into Bings Creek, the whole creek became renamed Bings Creek because you name the creek after the mouth up. And so Holmes Creek got lost as far as official place names go, but that's the place it was. And that was actually the drinking water supply for Duncan. All right, next slide. So in the recent past, there has been some attention paid to Quamichan and Somenos, and usually it was in response to a local, I'm not going to go through each one of these events, and I'm sure you're all greatly relieved. But each one of these events usually represents some sort of tragedy, fish kills, or strange algae blooms. And so when I look at some of these older literature, what I see is anomalous fish kill in the 1950s. This is like a regular event now. Happens every year. Never before seen blue-green algae bloom. This is in the early 1960s. And these things started to pop up and become more frequent, and that's what you see when you read the studies is the frequency of that is going up. And so my personal experience kicks in about 2010 here, so a lot of this is populated by stuff I've done. But we've been studying this system long enough to know, even within this short time span, just like Tim was saying, there's been a ramp down from a previous state to something which exists now. And for a lot of folks, it's difficult to perceive because, hey, a lot of folks in the valley just moved here 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I moved here 10 years ago myself. So I'm no better than anyone else. But it's important to recognize that and to learn from that history 50 years back, 500 years back, 5,000 years back. Next, please.
Okay. 10 minutes.
Great. So this is what you see in the lake. This is a not so bad blue-green algae bloom. When it's really bad, it looks like paint on the surface. Next slide. There's a speedboat going through it. I'd never seen anything like that before. The water was churned up green. I've seen it as thick as gravy in some places because the blue-green algae is so dense. Next slide. There's something that occurs pretty much every year now. This is all pumpkin seed sunfish, so at least we've gone some way towards controlling the pumpkin seed population. That is making a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Next slide. And the consequence downstream in Somenos Creek is what you see here, which is parrot's feather. This is all parrot's feather. And it's an active area of investigation that we want to clean up because the water below here has no oxygen in it. We need to clean that up so the fish can get through. Somenos Creek, by the way, is the most dense aggregation of coho salmon in the entire Cowichan Valley, and about this time of year as they're staging to go to sea. So you think, oh, it's a small system, what difference will it make? It makes a huge difference because this is one of the few places they have as refuge. And so if there's no oxygen in that water, they lost that refuge. It's these little bites, the ratchet, right? Another little pawl down the ratchet. Next slide. So how did we get here? Well, I just outlined the changes to the water courses, changes in land cover, changes in climate. I'm going to show you some stuff which I think will be pretty compelling about that. And so to find a way out of here, we've got to start monitoring this on a regular basis, not having the fire wagon come down from the provincial or federal government whenever they deign it necessary or have a huge enough response that they have to. Next slide. This is air temperatures at the Nanaimo airport in July, August, and September. And what you see is that from the 1940s to the present day, it's been climbing up and really dramatically turned up in the 1980s, so that now our summer air temperature, on average, is about 2 degrees warmer than it was 50 years ago. That's a big change, and that actually, if this nudges up to 18 degrees, that moves us into warm Mediterranean-type climate by the Köppen climate system, which means we are essentially the same as Rome, Italy. So if people want to know from the rest of Canada why we have water storage problems, it's because we're more like Rome than we're like Calgary. Next. Summer dry season is longer, so this analysis I did starting in January into December for each year from 1940 to the present. And what we wind up with is that summer, the dry season, is more than 5.5 months long now, whereas historically it was about 4.5 months. So we got 30 extra days of summer. It's hotter, it's drier, it's longer. We got a water storage problem. It's going to affect fish habitat. Next slide. So one of the things we've been looking at is for the province, because they can no longer afford to cover this stuff, is looking at water quality. And one of the most important parameters we've been looking at is E. coli in the water. That's your risk of getting a stomach bug if you go into the water. Lots of swimming holes around here. We were talking about how people used to swim in the lakes, right? The primary contact threshold, which is getting in the water and actually swimming around, is 77 coliform units per 100 mils. So you got 100 mils. They don't want more than 77 little bacteria units in there, or else you're going to get sick. Secondary contact, that's getting splashed on you. They're willing to take 385. So next slide there. So you can see that for most of our stations, this is some sampling we did at Coxsila River, Averil Creek, Bings Creek, Cowichan River, Kw'amutsun Creek at the head, Kw'amichan Lake, Richards Creek, and Somenos Creek. We found at Bings Creek 781 coliform units per 100 mils. That was the average. It was higher at some times. That's not good. Next slide. This was in 2017. It said 2018. That was actually 2017. We went out again this year. We were looking mostly at some of the creeks around there. You see the numbers are a little bit better, but these stations here in the Cowichan River, and you can see the Cowichan River is mostly good. It's the stations like Bings Creek at Tanzer Road, Menzies Creek, and Bings Creek. We're all always above the primary contact threshold, but below the secondary. So, you know, these sorts of systems which used to be used for recreation can't be used for that anymore. So again, this is a loss to the economy. It's a loss to people's property value because they're being alienated from recreational things they can do. Next slide.
5 minutes.
Next slide.
Sorry.
Thanks. We're also looking at phosphorus. This is the chief villain behind the blue-green algae bloom that a lot of you have seen on the lakes. And the objectives for the province sets for fish habitat is mean of 5 samples. We do 5 samples in the summer and 5 samples in the winter at 0.005 milligrams per liter, 0.007 milligrams per liter. That's the maximum they want to see in any of your samples. Next slide. So last year we go in. This is this red line and blue line down here, that's the standard. Okay? This is what we're getting from some of our sites, Richards Creek, Quamichan Creek, Kw'amutsun Lake. These, so 1.7 would be as high as this again through the roof. This one here, the maximum we observed would be somewhere up on the 2nd story of the building. This is what we've done to the environment with land use practices. The lakes act as a storage for this. There's probably something on the order of 20,000 tons of phosphorus in Somenos and Qu'amutsun Lake. Next slide. This is from some of the creeks. The creek numbers are a little bit lower because they don't act as repositories for that phosphorus, but you can see that they're still well in excess of the thresholds. And so this is our target. We can get there, but this just shows you the scale of the hole that we've dug ourselves. This is why your lakes have blue-green algae in them, is because of this. Next slide. This is just looking at lake levels. Next slide. So historically, you can see that it pretty much looks like it was. So we haven't changed the lake levels from the 1960s to the present too much. What you do see is that historically, these numbers are a little bit lower, which is reflective of the longer summer. So now, this number is down here. But most of the rest of the year is pretty much the same. Next slide. This is some of the monitoring work we've been doing. This is from temperature data loggers in the lake. So we've got a good handle on how temperature changes in the lake, and that's important because when this temperature goes above 20, that alienates fish from the habitat. They'll stay away, especially the trout and the salmon. Next slide. So I'm going to just show you some of the monitoring we've done in Somenos Lake to determine when the lake becomes hostile to fish. Next slide. So this is 2015 to the present, and this is from 0 meters to 6 meters. So you can see that these red is usually the summer. So the temperature gets lethal to fish in most years over the summer, and the length of that lethal period changes. And you can see the deeper water, it's actually survivable for the fish. Anything that's yellow, they can hack it, but they're not comfortable. Next slide. We're also monitoring oxygen. So we can see, however, although the temperature is good down there, the oxygen's bad. So these lakes used to be full of trout all summer. I found a newspaper article from 1907 talking about how some chap went down and had a good day because he caught 36 rainbow trout. This is in August, August the 7th. We don't get 36 rainbow trout there anymore. Okay, next slide. We're also looking at pH, and you can see similar sorts of patterns. And when we overlie them, this is the situation facing the fish. It's like a gauntlet. In Somenos Lake, those guys can get out to the creeks when this happens, but in Qu'amutsun Lake, there's not too many refuges for them. Next slide. So what are we going to do to get out of this? Well, we have wetland creation, which is important because that acts as water storage, so water can be slowly released into those lakes in the summer. Wetlands are hugely important, and a lot of those have been taken out. So one of our big goals is to recreate those. We have a large-scale plan for Bings Creek to restore a lot of wetlands there, and you may have seen work we've done at Beverly Street where we recreated a wetland that used to exist. We need to encourage riparian buffers, again, slowing water movement, but also helping to remediate pollution that's going into the system, and that's one of the big focuses of the work that's going to happen, hopefully as a result of this project that you're participating in. And developing water storage. We talk about storage at Cowichan Lake. We really need to think about water storage at the lakes as well, because a lot of those pollution problems can be helped by different ways that water can act on the system. And we also need to work with landowners to increase awareness about the effects of some of the discharges of different nutrients and pollutants coming off the land. Next slide. So this really got messed up. Thank you, Apple. That's why I do Windows. Okay, so we have a lot of sponsors that help us out. Those are all okay. Our partners include Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the Provincial Ministry of Environment, the Cowichan Watershed Board. North Cowichan has been a fantastic partner in some of the work. This is just the water quality monitoring work we do too. I mean, we are in a couple of other projects, and I invite you to check out our webpage to see some of that other work we're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That was great. Did anyone want to ask Dave a couple questions?
I thought I went over.
You're perfect, actually. Right on time. So go ahead. We'll take a few questions now and then for about 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I didn't see any mention there about the change in waterfowl habitat.
Yeah.
In other words, everywhere you look, there's thousands of Canada geese.
Yeah.
That can't be a good thing.
No, well, so the Canada geese story is an interesting one because there was Canada geese here always, of course. But there was a native population, an introduced population of ones which were purposely meant to be residential. And that's the whole eastern part of the island. And so that was, again, like a lot of these things, it was purposefully done in order to create an opportunity. And the opportunity was hunting for Canada geese, which was very popular. But what wound up happening was these geese, which were designed to be residential, stayed. And the unintended consequence was their effect on water quality, because they do have a marked effect on water quality, and that they interfere with other species' ability to access those areas. So a lot of these stories that happen historically are just that, the unintended consequences of an action that maybe could have been seen if there was a little bit of deeper thought, but sometimes there was too much of a willingness to believe that a manipulation that was done was going to be a win-win-win scenario. And I've become incredibly skeptical anytime I hear that sort of talk. And so a lot of these problems are going to be honestly dealing with what the trade-offs are, who's going to be taking a bit of a hit, and who's going to be getting a bit of a benefit, and being honest about what those trade-offs are, and realizing that there is not going to be a win-win-win scenario. You can't have more of everything, and being honest about how we want to get there. And so I think that's really the take-home lesson is that for all of these decisions we made in the past, they were predicated on the belief that nothing but good will flow from that decision. And we have to be mature enough to realize that we live in a world where each decision has a consequence, some of them good, some of them bad, and being more honest about the trade-offs involved in those decisions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about 20,000 tons of phosphorus between Somenos and Qu'amutsun.
That's a back of the envelope estimate that I did. So
How much of it needs to come out, and how does it come out?
So that's a good example of the kinds of trade-offs that I was talking about. Burnaby excavated a lake near the downtown, which was used for recreation, but had been subject to blue-green algae blooms like this, and it's a similar size. To excavate the bottom of the lake took 10 years and cost $25 million. That's likely not the approach we're going to take, because I think if you walked into Ted Swaby's office and said, we're going to make this happen, he would say, I'm going to call up the police now, and that would be the end of the conversation. So there are other approaches which involve ways to get rid of the phosphorus. So for example, you could, like I was talking about water storage, have water from off-site pumped through the system so that when the phosphorus is suspended in the lake in the middle of the summer, and incidentally, it's the deoxygenation that resuspends that stored phosphorus from the sediments. So if you were flushing it out at that point, you'd be getting rid of phosphorus. That's a kind of an approach. Another approach is chemicals which are coming on the market now, which hold on to phosphorus under a variety of oxygenation states, and those will settle the phosphorus out and it will stay out of the system. So essentially you lock it away. In fact, the most common product is something called Phos-Lock because it serves that function. And another new approach, something Tim and I have talked about, which is very exciting to a lot of folks, is using what's called a microbubbler. Before there used to be oxygenation as a way to deal with this, but the oxygen bubbles tended to roil up the system. So what you would get is this effect where you'd just be churning the system up. And in shallow lakes like Somenos and Qu'amutsun, putting in an old style bubbler would actually make things worse. The microbubblers, they introduce oxygen to the water at depth. Microbubbles are neutrally buoyant, so that oxygen stays down deep. It doesn't come to the surface. And so that's a way of locking away the phosphorus, because when the water's oxygenated, the phosphorus stays in the sediment. So again, that would be locking it away. So that's just 3 different approaches. There's about half a dozen. They all have costs, financial costs, social costs, and so what I'm going to be discussing with North Cowichan when I present them the Kw'amutsun Lake sampling results, because we did sampling all last year in Kw'amutsun Lake, real intensive sampling, is those sorts of trade-offs that'll be available to deal with them. And we're also looking at similar sorts of questions for Somenos, of course. My hope is that whatever winds up happening is we look at Somenos and Qu'amutsun together, because my suspicion is that dealing with them as a unit is going to be a lot cheaper in the end than dividing them up. So again, it's going to be trade-offs and it's going to be some hard choices, but I'm comfortable with the folks around here being mature enough to be able to engage in the discussion. And if somebody comes along and says win, 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 just turn around and run away, please.